If any of you already have questions that you want to incorporate into the Q&A portion of our discussion today, feel free to pop them into Q&A at any time. You can use the Q&A function at any time, and then I will be moderating those questions. We're joined today, of course, by Jay Rosen of NYU. My name is Bridget. I am an engagement manager at Hearken, which is an audience engagement consultancy firm. Hi, Josh. Hi, Switzerland. Thank you for being here. A little evening entertainment in Switzerland. And we'll start in just a moment as people keep coming in. I'm here because Hearken and Jay have been working for a while now on the Citizens Agenda approach and what it could mean for elections this year. And I'm managing a project that has grown out of that effort. I'm just going to hop back to show you what this is real quick here, called Election SOS. You can find us at electionsos.org. And we are offering free training in the Citizens Agenda style that you can come away with a strategy for your newsroom for how you can apply this very model into your own elections reporting. So you can apply for that free training at electionsos.org. I'll give more details after we hear from Jay if you want to stick around, but if you want to just go ahead and visit that website, I'll put it in the chat so you can just link to it, electionsos.org. We're very excited to be able to share this training with you. Welcome, welcome. We're just saying hi in the chat. All right. Jay, would you like to get started, or would you like to give folks another couple minutes to join us here?
Let's give them 60 seconds.
Let's get 60 seconds. Get in your chat. Tell us where you're joining from so we can say hi. Check out electionsos.org.
Give me an estimate of how many people we have.
We currently have, let's see, it just came into 35. We have over 100 registered, so they'll be receiving the recording after the show. So thank you so much, everyone, for making the time to be here today. We really appreciate it. Anyone else joining us from anywhere that's fun, that's 110 degrees or otherwise? Having earthquakes or otherwise? Shared in the chat. Welcome to those of you just joining us. We're going to get started very soon talking about the Citizens Agenda. And at any point, if you have questions, just pop them in that Q&A function, because we're going to have some good time for Jay to address your questions as well. Minnesota. Hi, Chris. I'm in Wisconsin. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jay Rosen, who has been talking about the Citizens Agenda for some time and really has a wonderful model to present to you today. We do invite your questions at any time. Just use the Q&A function in the chat box, and then we'll have a Q&A section after we hear from Jay regarding the Citizens Agenda. And as I mentioned, we will be talking more at the end of the call about how you can apply to join our free training on putting the Citizens Agenda to work in your own newsroom. And that website again is electionsos.org. So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much, Jay, for being with us today, and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Bridget. And hello, everyone, from Switzerland to Mexico, from Florida to Oregon. I'm Jay Rosen. I teach journalism at New York University. I study the American press, and I have been studying for a long time problems in political journalism, and especially in election coverage. The Citizens Agenda style, which you're going to hear about today, is an alternative model of election coverage. Whenever you hear the word alternative, you're entitled to ask, alternative to what? And in this case, the alternative is to election coverage as usual, or whatever you would normally do, or the default model for covering campaigns, or the horse race model for covering campaigns, which is pretty common, or even the we know what the issues are approach to campaign coverage. The citizens' agenda is an alternative to all of those things. And I'm going to explain what that basic model is, go through the key steps and how to do it, and then we can have questions. This talk is on the record and you're welcome to tweet anything you hear from it. Okay, next slide, please, Bridget. So the citizens' agenda is best understood as a style in which election coverage can be done, an alternative style. Next slide. And it starts when you ask the people you are trying to inform, what do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? This is the key question and the moment around which the entire citizens' agenda model revolves. But first, you have to decide who are the people we're trying to inform. And the better your answer is, the sharper, clearer your answer is, the better your coverage will be. If the people you are trying to form is a hazy concept, then you're going to run into trouble. Next slide, please. You try to get good answers back from this question, what do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes, by executing on a listening plan. Next slide. And then you render the results of asking that question as a published product, the citizens' agenda. This published product, an actual agenda or priority list, becomes an engagement map and a direction finder for your campaign coverage. It becomes your instructions for how to cover the campaign. Next slide. Once you have synthesized the citizens' agenda that you heard by asking people, what do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? You can pressure the candidates to address the problems on the citizens' agenda. Here's what people told us they want this campaign to be about. What do you, as a candidate for office, have to say in reply? Next slide. You can also do in-depth journalism around the problems and issues that rise in the citizens' agenda. And one of the most important reasons we're advocating this approach in 2020 is that when the next media storm comes, you have something to hold on to. You have a way of not getting swept away in the moment, in propaganda, in some phony controversy or distraction that has been manufactured to dominate news coverage. Part of the purpose of doing citizens' agenda journalism is that it gives you something to return to when you don't know which direction to go in during tense moments in the campaign, which are extremely likely from now until November in the United States. Next slide, please. Another way to think about the citizens' agenda is it's a list of priorities that you got from the public by listening well to it. And this list of priorities gets updated during the campaign and becomes, as we said earlier, a set of instructions for how to cover the campaign. Next slide. So the citizens' agenda style of election coverage is just my dorky name for it. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it Elections 2020. You can call it Your Voice, Your Vote. It doesn't matter what brand you give it for your public. And so if you don't like the name Citizens Agenda Style, journalists are always arguing with me about my names. They say they hate jargon, which is fine with me. So just retitle it anything you want. It's still the same concept. And the active ingredient is, what do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? That's our magic question. Next slide, please. It's important to emphasize that the agenda is an editorial product. It's a work of synthesis. It involves art and judgment, not just data. It's creative listening to the people that you're trying to inform. You can't just read the results off a chart the way you would with an opinion poll or a spreadsheet. So since it's an editorial product, one that you create with your own knowledge of your community and your ability to listen and synthesize, you have to be prepared to defend it. You have to be able to explain your thinking, take responsibility for what you say is the citizens' agenda, and inform the people that you're trying to inform about how you did this. Next slide, please. So here are some reasons you may be drawn to the citizens' agenda style. Which ones apply to you? Next slide. Election coverage is the way we've always done, simply won't cut it. If you believe this, or if this is a common belief in your newsroom, then you may be attracted to the citizens' agenda model. Next. If you're trying to become more audience focused, this is the audience focused way of doing election coverage. Next. If you believe that traditional approaches still work, but we need something new, we want to distinguish ourselves from competitors, this is a way to do that. Next. If your newsroom believes you have to become more responsive to your community in order to restore connection, restore trust, if this has become an issue in your newsroom, then the citizens' agenda can help with that. Next. If you believe, as I do, that after the disaster of 2016, journalists cannot return in 2020 with the same equipment or intention, then the citizens' agenda is a way to respond to that. Next. And if you're a believer in engagement journalism, which is a rising alternative at large, then this is the engagement journalism version of election coverage. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's go through the key steps. How do you do it? This is what journalists always want to know. How do I do it? And it's the right question to ask, because until you grasp what steps you actually have to take to do this style of journalism, you don't really understand it. So let's dig into that. Key steps in the citizens' agenda style of campaign coverage. Next. First step is to identify, especially to yourselves, the people you are trying to inform. Who are the people we reach? Who are the people we want to reach? What is our natural public? What is our aspirational public? When I say identify the people you're trying to inform, most audiences for news include not just one community like Dallas, but many sub-communities or audience segments. And you have to know which ones you reach well and which ones you don't. And you have to know who you're making this product election coverage for. And until you're able to identify the people you're trying to inform, it's hard to do any of the other steps in this method. So that's the first step. Figure out who you're trying to inform. And the better, sharper that your own understanding, your own image of the public is, the better your coverage will be. Next step, please. Then you ask the people you're trying to inform a simple question. What do you want the candidates to be discussing as they compete for votes? You don't just ask it once, you ask it again and again, as we will see. Next step. You keep asking it as you execute on your listening plan. And what we mean by a listening plan is, how are we going to get this question? What do you want candidates to be discussing as they compete for votes? I want this to be about? How are we going to get this question to everyone it needs to go to? And that means using every tool and method we have. Fortunately, in the era of digital journalism, we have a lot of tools. So it's call us, write us, fax us, believe it or not, if you remember what that is. Fill out our form, come to our meeting, jump online with us, pass this ballot along, write to us, take our survey, respond online, come to our Facebook page, tweet us. everything that you can think of to get more and more answers to this simple question. What do you want the candidates to be discussing as they compete for votes? And by a listening plan, I also mean, besides using every device known to digital journalism, it also means a plan for reaching the parts of the community that are hard to reach, that you don't ordinarily hear from, that you have an aspiration to begin addressing. So your listening plan may have to include special plans to get this question to people who don't ordinarily talk to you. So that's what we mean by executing on your listening plan. Next step, please. Then when the answers start coming in, you have to begin interpreting what you heard. You have to use your knowledge of your community, your knowledge as journalists of the campaign, of the issues, and begin fashioning what you're hearing into a priority list. Next step. Synthesize the results into a draft agenda, which is, here's our best guess for what people told us when we asked them, what do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? So that's a priority list that originates in your active listening. Next step. And then you have to take this draft agenda and test it by going back to people who you've talked to and saying, does this look right? By trying it out on different audiences and seeing if what they told you is reflected in the draft agenda, by putting it to the sort of a stress test with members of the community. Next step, please. And if you can get any help from opinion polling, from local universities, or from fans and supporters who want your coverage to be better, then this is the step where they can best help, is testing to see if we have got this correct. Right? So that's the fifth step, is to testing your approach. Sixth, next step, please. When you're confident that your list of priorities reflects what you heard, or when you simply come to the point in your plan where you have to go live, you actually publish the Citizens Agenda as a live product on your site. And that's a key moment, because what you're saying when you publish the Citizens Agenda is, we asked, and this is what you told us. This is what you want the campaign to be about. And we're not only telling you this is the priority list, but we're going to use it to inform our coverage, and we're going to try and get the candidates to address it. Next step, please. So here's an example of how simple it is to do this approach. This is the way the Tyee in British Columbia and Canada last year used this approach to do its election coverage. We asked you, what do you want the candidates to be talking about? And you told us. And now in this case, the Tyee combined its reader-powered election reporting with a crowdsourced funding campaign to support the extra people they needed to do this extra coverage. So next slide, please. So here's what it came down to. This is the results of our reader-powered election reporting plan. Remember I said you don't have to call it the Citizens Agenda, just give it any name you want. The Tyee called it the reader-powered election reporting plan. And here are the 5 top questions, they phrased them as questions, that emerged from asking their readers. One is about climate change, one is about tax policy. Next slide, please. One is about the green economy and how do we get there. One is about First Nations, which is their term for Native Americans. And one is about dental care as a part of healthcare. So these are very important issues that come not from the reporters saying we know what the issues are, but come from listening to readers. And they're gonna not only do journalism about those big 5 questions, but they're gonna get very good answers. They're gonna try to get very good answers from candidates to those same questions. Next slide. So as I said, when you feel you've got it, you publish the citizens agenda as a live product on your site. And then you use the citizens agenda to instruct your campaign reporting, because you know that these are the problems that connect with the people who are depending on you for election coverage. So that's the next step, is let the citizens agenda instruct your campaign reporting. Next slide. Then you press the candidates to address the items on the citizens agenda. And when they do, you tell the voters. This is how you know it's working, is when you are able to get to that 8th step there. Next slide, please. Most newspapers and public radio stations and news sources that know what they're doing in election coverage use at the end a voter's guide. A voter's guide is a very simple informational product that has all the candidates down one side of the guide and the important issues across the top. And it tells you what each of the candidates in all the important races says about the key issues. And this is one of the most valuable things, one of the most well-used tools that newsrooms produce for voters. And the Citizens Agenda is a very natural way to build your voter's guide. In fact, it flows directly into it. In a way, the entire model is a voter's guide approach to the campaign. Next, please. And of course, just because somebody said in March that this is what he wants the candidates to be talking about when they compete for votes, the answer in September and October may not be the same. And so you have to keep listening for revisions to the citizens agenda until the campaign ends. But if you can do that, and one of the things that's going to happen is that the candidates will be picking up the same things you're hearing in your citizens agenda style of election coverage. And when they're hearing what you're hearing, then they know they're going to have to speak to those issues. And by getting the candidates to speak to what you know the voters want to hear about, you are performing a public service. A public service that is much deeper and more connected to your community and more valuable than who's going to win and how are they doing it. Next. So here in one slide are the steps, and we're just going to give you a little white space here, Bridget, for them to review these steps. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Thank you. Now here is a caution for you. If you think that what I just said is, let's do issues instead of the horse race, you're not really listening, because we have asked a different question. How do journalists know what the issues are? The whole point of the citizens agenda is to get the issues from the voters rather than assuming that you already know, or rather than borrowing what the candidates and their campaigns and their handlers and their advisors say are the issues. You are defining the issues in the campaign by listening to the people that you're trying to inform. And so it's not just issues rather than process or something like that. It's This is what we heard when we asked the people we're trying to inform, what do you want the candidates to be discussing as they compete for votes? Next slide, please. This is something I believe very deeply. I indicated it earlier, but I'm going to go back over it. You can't keep from getting sucked into someone else's agenda without a firm grasp on your own. Because you have to know what your own priorities are in election coverage. So you can't keep from getting sucked into another's agenda, like, say, for example, President Trump, without a firm grasp on your own agenda. But where does that agenda come from? Next slide. Can't come from the newsroom. They're not necessarily always in touch. Next slide. It has to come from the voters you are trying to inform. That's what we have been saying in this presentation. Next slide. Okay, so those are the steps, and that's the reasoning behind the Citizens Agenda. It's not a new concept. It actually originated pre-internet, pre-web. Uh-oh.
Oh no, we lost Jay just when we were getting to the Q&A. Let me get him back, but now is the time. There you are, Jay. Sorry about that.
It's my fault. I don't know what happened, but I'm ready for questions if there are questions.
All right, so thank you so much. We've got a number of good questions that have come in, but similarly, I'm going to give everyone just a moment to think about what you would like to ask Jay. And let's review sort of the overall journey of this model, right? You start by understanding your own vision for what you'd like to accomplish with your election coverage. You have to know who you're trying to reach when you ask that critical question. What do you want the candidates to be discussing as they compete for your vote? Then you go out, you ask that question, synthesize what you find into that draft agenda, and keep using it. And we've got
you left something out.
Yes.
You need to form a listening plan.
Form a listening plan. Thank you. Yeah.
And then go out and do the listening.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take just a couple minutes here till the bottom of the hour. Think about your questions, pop them in that Q&A, and then we'll have a nice long period to have Jay address your questions. If you'd like me to identify you and your organization, just put that information in with your question. I'd be happy to call you out to Jay. Thank you to those who have submitted your questions. I've got them queued up. Just want to give everyone a chance to think and type. Thank you, thank you. One more minute. Anything you want to add? Anything you want to ask? And of course, during the Q&A portion, you can ask your questions as we go. We've got a lot of good questions here, starting from the very broad to the very granular, which we love. Great. Thank you. Got another couple coming in. All right. So Jay, I'd like to start with a question that came in about the overall approach. And this question says, this sounds like an organization-wide shift in thought, but what can reporters and producers do on an individual level to apply the style of reporting to their work, particularly if their organizations might not be able or willing to invest their resources in shifting from conventional political reporting to the citizens' agenda style?
Okay, well, it's correct that this is best done when the organization as a whole grasps the need for it and decides to shift to it. And if you are not working in an organization that sees the need or is willing to shift, that's going to make life difficult. That's true. However, the question is about what can an individual do? And I think there is a way to do it, and that involves the simple fact that in election coverage, you have many opportunities to talk to voters. And even the most traditional editor will agree that it's important to talk to voters. And so whenever you have the chance to talk to voters, you can put to them our key question. What do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? And if you can manage to ask that question a lot from a lot of different kinds of people that you meet on the campaign trail, you can build your own internal sense of a citizen's agenda that you can use for your own reporting and to push back against those in the newsroom who claim to have knowledge about this question but haven't done the work. And so what I would do if I were in that situation is not only ask this question every opportunity I get, but keep a count of the number of people you have posed the question to, so that in internal discussions, you can later say, you know, I've asked 75 different people in our community this question, and that has never come up, you know, or something like that. So I think you can kind of do it as a fugitive, as a underground journalist, but it's going to take some wit and some determination to succeed as an individual. It really is a newsroom-wide or newsroom culture shift.
And as a follow-up to that, we had a similar question, which is, how do you approach executing this within an entrenched industry or beat? What if they're just not willing to try something new?
Well, that's always a problem. It's difficult to get people to change. That's been true for my entire career. In a way, I wrote an entire book about it called What Are Journalists For in 1999. But I guess I would start just by asking these traditionalists if they believe that their traditions are working, and what is the evidence that they're working. You know, are we deeply trusted by our community? Is this model of election coverage we've used in the past, has it been spectacularly successful? And there's another really interesting question you can ask those who don't want to change. What are we trying to accomplish by doing election coverage the way we've always done it? And very often, the people defending quote unquote traditional election coverage can't answer that question. If you ask, what are you trying to accomplish by covering the campaign the way you are always covering it? The answer is usually some sort of circular reasoning. You know, we're covering the campaign to cover the campaign. What do you mean? We're covering the campaign where we always cover the campaign. And so I would try and somehow get at that circularity. But if you're in a newsroom that refuses to recognize that trust in the news media is eroding, that trust in the political system is also eroding, and if they look around them in the ruins of American politics and media, and they don't see anything worth changing, it is hard to know what to do in that situation. So I sympathize with you.
We've got a number of people who are interested in the outreach component that's so crucial, how you reached out to certain communities. I'm going to combine two questions together here. One is that what suggestions might you have for reaching communities that don't follow or read us? What tactics could you use? And then a second question came in about how to reach audiences who may not trust us. So it could be new audiences.
Right.
Audiences you're not currently reaching or who may not trust you. What might you do to reach them?
Well, the first suggestion I would have is to lead with the message that you're trying something different, that you are going to be basing your election coverage on listening rather than lecturing to the community. And some humility at the outset would be very valuable. You may want to go a step further and saying, you know, in the past, we haven't actually listened very much to this community, but we want to change that. And we're going to start with our election coverage this year. So that might be another approach. Another way to do it would be to start not with your election coverage, but with listening to portions of the community that feel neglected, and fess up to past behavior, to mistakes you've made. This is going on in journalism now. Every day you see a newsroom fessing up to what it overlooked or didn't do in the past. And so kind of community conversation, community advisory board that begin that work might be a first step. And then once you've begun to hear from people in a neglected community, then you can begin to introduce the Citizens Agenda style election coverage as demonstration that this has practical consequences. It's not just meetings for the sake of meeting. So that would be another example. I would also recommend that this is a long-term process. And so you may want to start with just one micro community and figure out what kind of process works and then begin extending it to others. But you have to discipline your expectations, because 30, 40 years of neglect aren't going to be overcome in a simple roundtable discussion, right? And so it's probably a smart idea to target communities that have been not listening or aren't there on the receiving end of your product, but to do so slowly and learn from one as you begin outreach to another. Those are all fairly obvious steps, but those are the best ones we have. Sometimes the problem's not complicated. You don't need a clever strategy. You just need to start listening with humility.
We have a question that I think builds on that idea, which is that about how reaching these communities can build trust. So we have an attendee who says, given that the youth vote tends to be the most difficult to win and how they tend to have increasing mistrust in media outlets, how can this model help to build trust in those voters and encourage them to understand the issues that impact them and get out the vote? And I'll put this in the chat as well, because I've got a printer going off now.
Well, that's a challenge for sure. I think the way I would try to do it, excuse me, is create some sort of ballot, meaning a piece of content that has this crucial question on it. What do you want the candidates to be discussing to compete for votes, as well as a way for people to give their answer. And you think of it as like a ballot, like almost like a mail-in ballot. And this piece of content has many different expressions. It can be attached to a tweet. It can be printed in a newspaper. It has a URL. It can be found online. It can be shared in a Snapchat. It's an image. It's text. If young people are the target, then find young people who are willing to help you get this ballot to other young people. So it becomes like a campaign in itself. And you keep track of how many young people you've heard from and create a kind of a goal. Like, we want a citizens agenda that reflects at least 1,000 young people. And you make it a goal to get the ballot to as many people as possible and return, and you kind of keep track of how many filled out ballots you have. And you ask people, to share it with their friends, and you give progress reports on what you're hearing, right? And you may even decide that you need more than one citizens agenda. You need one for the community as a whole, and then you need a young person's citizens agenda, because their concerns are different, and they deserve to be heard. Right? And that might be a way of reconnecting with a demographic group or a part of the community that you don't speak to now. Is we're going to produce a young person's citizens agenda, and we have young people helping us do it. That would be the kind of approach I would recommend.
We had the questions about how to reach audiences that may not trust us, or maybe you're not reaching, but we also have a couple questions about how to approach this when a community is deeply divided on what's important. And a separate question asking, how do you account for the influence of national news media on the audience priority of issues? So agenda setting.
I may need you to remind me about those questions. So I'm going to answer the second one first. Very often, public opinion researchers find that when you ask people in local communities about national politics, you get instant division, polarization, repetition of slogans and sound bites that come from the top of the political system. And it's just a very familiar mess, deeply polarized mess. But if you can switch the conversation from national politics to local problems, not necessarily local issues, because issues can sometimes get packaged by political elites so that they mirror national polarization. But if you can start with local problems and listen deeply to people across political divisions, very often what they care about at the local level doesn't fit in or map onto the polarization at the national level. And so that's really the only advice I have on that, is that if you let the conversation about election 2020 drift into the national dialogue or the battle between Trump and Biden, it's just going to reflect what we already know too well. But the more you can focus on solving problems at the local level, or addressing the things that people are very worried about in their lives, the less that you're going to import that hyper-polarized environment at the national level. What was the first part of the question?
The first part of the question, which I may or may not apply to the national dialogue. So as I ask these questions, please, if you asked it, feel free to follow up if there's something you'd like to follow up on. The first part of the question was what your thoughts are on how to approach this when a community is deeply divided on what is important.
Well, usually a community that's deeply divided is deeply divided over longstanding issues that have been fought over for years. And often, if you simply go into this with open-ended, open-hearted listening, and really do ask people, what do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? Are they really going to say the same old issues we've been fighting about for 40 years? Is that really what they want the candidates to be discussing? And so I think there's power in this question that maybe isn't coming through in this presentation, but would in practice, right? Because the question we're asking you to start with is not, what are your 5 top issues? Because that invites people to give you prepackaged emotion. Right? We're asking for something that's kind of like prior to that step. What do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? Or what do you want this campaign to be about, right? And maybe people will give you, we want it to be about what we've always been fighting about for the last 30 years. Maybe they'll say that, but I think there's a very good chance they won't. And so the job of the journalist is to is to pose that question in a very open-ended way, not assuming you know what the issues are, not assuming that the voters necessarily know before they're asked, and then to listen with an open mind and try and formulate the issues on the citizens' agenda in a way that eludes some of these traps and snares and sandbars. But as I said in my presentation, this takes skill. It's an art. Framing issues is tricky. It takes a lot of knowledge. It takes nuance. Yeah, familiar divides are always going to be there. But everybody lives in the same place. And that's why if you focus more on local problem solving, sometimes you can elude some of those divisions.
We had an attendee who was curious if you could expand on the art and judgment used in this approach with a real life example or two.
Well, what happens when you ask people, what do you want the candidates to be as they compete for votes, is they give you lots of different answers that on the surface sound different, sound like people talking about different things. But if you listen carefully, what happens is that the sentiment underneath them is common to answers that appear on their surface to be different. And so people might have all kinds of answers about what they want candidates to be discussing, but what it could add up to is something like, we're losing control of our future. Or our young people are not going to be able to live here. Right? And that's what I mean, is listening for the emotion underneath the answer. And what's going to happen if you keep asking this question that we keep repeating, what do you want the candidates to be discussing so it can be for votes? If you keep asking it, what's going to happen is that people's answers are going to begin to sound similar to your ear. They're going to sound similar. Oh yes, we've heard this from other people. And when they sound similar to your ear, a transcript of people's remarks might not look similar, but it's going to sound similar to you. And I say it's an art because you have to put that similar sound into words. And that's what a good writer does. That's what an empathetic listener does. That's what somebody who is well connected to their community can do. And the alternative to that kind of subtle, nuanced listening is just accepting prepackaged issues that the political system is spitting out because they meet somebody's tactical goal.
It occurs to me, Jay, that reminds me of the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism's approach for the February primary, where they just heard a lot about sort of the issues impacting real people like the gig economy. And they came to realize that the campaigns weren't really talking about that. And that became what they were asking questions about because it just sort of kept hitting their ear in that way.
Yeah, that's a good example. It's doubtful that those people use the terms, I'm really concerned about the gig economy, right? What they're talking about is, well, my kid can only get a part-time job and they don't have health insurance and right. And they're talking about the gig economy, but that's not how they understand it, right? Which I'm glad you said that, Bridget, because another way to look at this job is to draw a distinction, which I'm sure most of you can understand, between troubles on the one hand and issues on the other. This is a distinction C. Wright Mills, American sociologist, coined in the 1950s. Troubles are the things that people are worried about in their daily lives, the things that they talk with their spouse about over the kitchen table, the things that they are actively concerned about because they affect their daily life. Those are troubles. Issues are what the political system is fighting about. And C. Wright Mills's point in making this distinction is when troubles don't connect to issues, or the issues we're fighting about in the political sphere don't speak to people's troubles. We have a crisis of democracy and a crisis of journalism. And that's the problem that we're trying to address with the citizens' agenda. So what you're listening for when you ask, what do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes, is people's troubles. And then you're going to try and formulate them into issues that do connect with people's lives. And that's the whole art and spirit of the citizens' agenda approach.
And in line with that art, we've got a question from Chris Graves at Minnesota Public Radio, who's wondering, once you've had a draft agenda, but you're continuing to get feedback, do you suggest tweaking language as you go, or adding and modifying when it comes to how to be audience facing about adjusting those questions on your draft agenda?
Great question. Before I answer that, Chris, if Minnesota Public Radio still has its public insight network going, which was a really important, groundbreaking tool developed in your newsroom decades ago, this would be a great starting point for citizens' agenda coverage. And if it's gone, that's a big loss.
Sounds like it's gone.
It's gone, okay. Yeah. That was a mistake, Minnesota Public Radio. Okay, so when I say adjust, I think it's important to reiterate that this, once published, the Citizens Agenda is live. It's a live product. And what I mean by live is that it can change every day. And yes, you should be adding, changing nuances so that each item on the citizen agenda is better crafted, better stated. And if it's a matter of improving the wording or changing it so it's a little bit more expansive, then I think you can just do that day by day, because you should think of it as republished every day. When, however, something shifts and you have to introduce a whole new item to the citizens agenda, or if number 6 suddenly has to be stated as number 1, then that itself is a kind of news, and you should report on it. You should say, we've shifted our agenda and here's why. Because explaining changes in the citizens agenda helps you communicate that you're listening and that this is a live product. And so small changes, tweaks can be done, I think, day by day. You should think of it as republished every day at 8 a.m. maybe, or at 8 p.m. And major changes should be announced and discussed. And there can perhaps be an advisory board attached to this of people, volunteers who are extra enthusiastic about helping you do better election coverage. They could help be the sounding board for these kinds of changes.
We have time for one more question, but don't worry, everybody. If we didn't get to your question, stick around, because I'm going to give you another venue that you can use to get some answers. Liz Sheltons of Vox.com Video is wondering about your advice for international audiences. Lots of our viewers are US voters, but lots of them aren't. How do we balance the needs of the first group to just feel informed about something they can't necessarily influence with the needs of the second group?
That's a tough one. I'm not sure I have any ideas that you wouldn't already have, except that I always find it fascinating as an American to hear about how citizens and voters in other political systems, other countries, view American politics. And I'm always astonished at how knowledgeable they are and how people in other countries follow our politics. I mean, Canadians, it's unbelievable. Canadians are like more informed about American politics than Americans are. But there's a lot of people in Europe and Asia also who follow what's happening here. And I find their views of what we're fighting about to be very interesting. And so that can be one way of doing it. But I'm not sure I have better answers than you would have at Vox already about this. I think it's a challenge for sure, because journalism isn't really a global practice. I mean, you can try and imagine it that way, but in the end, journalism springs from the problems and conflicts in a given society, and so there's always going to be an element of outsiders and insiders in voting, and we call it a citizens' agenda because it may not be fair, it may not be great, but only citizens can vote, right? And so they're inherently in an election. There's inclusion and exclusion, but yeah, that's the best I can do. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer.
I think that leads us really well to how people can get involved if they're interested in moving this work forward in their newsrooms. And so we're really grateful to have collaborated with Jay on the Citizens Agenda project, which became this larger effort known as Election SOS. So if you're interested by what you heard today, if you're looking for some guidance, if you're looking for a place to connect to other journalists, please, please, please go to electionsos.org. We have several offerings I'm going to quickly tell you about, but if you just open up that web address on your browser, you'll be able to read in much more detail. If you want to design your own strategy for what a citizens agenda looks like, so I know we have a couple questions about how could we do polling, or how could we reach Spanish language audiences? We're offering 4-week training programs where you can develop a strategy for your newsroom. So participants walk away with actually a step-by-step plan for everything that Jay just talked about as it applies to your newsroom. And as you develop this plan, you're getting feedback from the facilitators in the Engaged Elections track, including myself, and also from your fellow participants in the cohort sharing their expertise and knowledge. So you get to connect with and learn from other journalists. And we've done 2 of these groups so far. We're currently accepting applications for our next training programs kicking off July, August, and September. And people really appreciate the fact that they get the chance to sort of think through this together, that they can reassess how they're serving their communities. And so again, I'll just pop this in the chat. Go to electionsos.org. The Citizens Agenda has inspired the entire engaged elections approach and really allows you to evaluate what your plan is going to be and design it to be flexible in that way. As I mentioned, we're currently accepting applications. If you are interested in applying for a July training program, those are due by the end of the day this Friday. So if you go to the website right now, request an application, it gets sent to you automatically and you can fill it out when you have the chance. Just be sure you get those in by Friday so you can think through really how you might put this into action at your newsroom. Yes, the recording will be available, Chris. We will send out the recording and the slides after the call, and also links to all the things I'm talking about right now. Another component of Election SOS is looking at how journalists can report on election security and keep themselves secure themselves. So, hey, if you've got this same time slot open tomorrow, we'd love for you to join us for how journalists can protect themselves from online harassment. Just go to bit.ly/protectjournos. I think that's something we can all agree is important. Register here. Join us for that conversation with Dr. Michelle Ferrier of Trollbusters. And then lastly, one item I want to be sure is on your radar is our community platform. This is a place where you can go to ask questions of people participating in these cohorts. If you want to hear from experts in election coverage like Jen Brandel, a co-founder of Hearken, if you want to design metrics to track your success, just go to this platform. Again, it's totally free. We're providing a place where people can connect with each other around those election needs. So again, electionsos.org, highly recommend you check it out. We've got a lot of different options ranging from the 4-week training to individual webinars to our newsletter. And we also really want to quickly thank our supporters for putting this together. The American Press Institute has a lot of great election reporting resources, and they're coordinating a real-time network that connects newsroom leaders to each other and to experts to address misinformation. It's called the Trusted Elections Network, and you can find it on their website. And the reason participation in all this training is free, the reason we're able to have Jay come and speak to us today is thanks to our supporter Democracy Fund. Normally these trainings would cost something like like $500, and you can participate just for the cost of a few minutes to fill out an application form. So again, I want to thank everyone for your time today. We are at the top of the hour. I want to especially thank Jay for being willing to share and really get into these questions with you. We'll share out the slides and the recording with everyone who registered, and give it a chance to electionsos.org. Check it out if you think there might be more conversation to have. Jay, thank you so much.
Can I add one thing before we?
Yeah.
If you have a newsroom, work in a newsroom that is ready to try the Citizens Agenda approach, and you have buy-in from the top as well as the people who would be actually doing the coverage, I will Zoom into your newsroom to help explain it and work with you on questions. So if that situation exists in your newsroom, let us know, and I will definitely consult with you about it on Zoom. It's free because it's part of the same program that Bridget just explained. So you be sure to let us know if that situation arises in your newsroom. Bye for now.
Thank you so much. And you can reach out to us at info@electionsos.org. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.